Every parent's worst nightmare is losing their child. Every child's deepest fear is being abandoned. On a dusty auction block in a frontier town, a young girl cries out, "I don't want to be sold like Mama was." The townspeople gather to watch as she's put up for bid. Then a scarred mountain man steps forward. Instead of bidding, he looks her in the eye and says, "She's mine. She's my daughter." Nobody knows if it's true, but in that moment he risks everything to save her. What follows is a story about two broken souls finding family in the most unlikely place. A man who forgot how to love must learn to be a father. A girl who lost everything must learn to trust again. But can they survive the town's dark secrets and the enemies closing in? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed Nathaniel Cross's declaration hung over Perdition Creek's main street like the dust kicked up by a stampede. For 37 years, he had lived alone in the mountains above this God-forsaken town, watching its moral decay from his perch among the pines. Today, for the first time since the war ended, he had descended into civilization and immediately regretted it. The girl on the auction block couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. Her auburn hair hung in tangled knots around a face that bore the kind of old pain no child should carry. The torn piece of her mother's dress, a faded blue calico, was clutched so tightly in her small fist that her knuckles had gone white. Blood stained the fabric, telling a story that made Nathaniel's jaw clench with remembered rage. "Your daughter." Sheriff Vernon Pike stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Pike was a small man, with the kind of cruel eyes that enjoyed other people's suffering. "That's mighty interesting, Cross, seeing as how nobody's laid eyes on you in town for nigh on 15 years. Nathaniel didn't flinch under the sheriff's scrutiny. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but those who knew him from the old days would recognize the deceptive calm, like a mountain cat before it pounced. "I've been away," he said simply. The crowd murmured, shifting like wheat in a dangerous wind. Perdition Creek had grown fat and lazy on its own corruption over the years. What had once been a decent mining town had become something else entirely, a place where justice could be bought and sold like cattle, where the strong preyed on the weak with impunity. At the back of the crowd stood the town's real power, Judge Cornelius Ashburn. Even from 50 yards away, Nathaniel could feel the man's calculating stare. Ashburn was everything Nathaniel despised about civilized society. Soft where he should be hard, cruel where he should be merciful, and corrupt to his very core. The judge's expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man who had never known honest work or honest hunger. "Temperance Morrison," the auctioneer continued nervously, glancing between Nathaniel and the sheriff. "Orphaned last week when her mama took ill. Starting bid is $50. $50, the price of a decent horse or a month's wages for most folks. That's what they valued this child's life at. I said she's mine." Nathaniel's voice carried across the square with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Ain't no bidding on my blood." The girl, Temperance, stared at him with eyes the color of spring grass. There was intelligence there and wariness, but also a flicker of something he recognized. Hope, maybe, or desperation. In his experience, they amounted to the same thing. "You got papers to prove that claim?" Sheriff Pike's voice carried a sneer. "Marriage certificate? Birth records?" Nathaniel had no such documents, of course. His connection to this girl was nothing more than an impulse born of seeing too much injustice for one lifetime. But sometimes a man had to draw a line in the dirt and see who was fool enough to cross it. "Don't need papers," he said. "Look at her eyes. Same as her mama's, same as mine." It was a lie, but delivered with such quiet conviction that even Pike hesitated. The truth was more complicated, buried in memories Nathaniel had spent decades trying to forget. There had been a woman once, before the war, before everything went to hell. A woman with green eyes and auburn hair who had loved him despite his rough edges. But that was ancient history, and this girl was someone else's tragedy. Still, When he looked at her, something stirred in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. "Rebecca Morrison was a good woman," said a voice from the crowd. Old Martha Holcomb stepped forward, her grey hair pinned severely back, her face etched with the kind of lines that came from decades of hard prairie living. "If she had dealings with you, Cross, it was before my time knowing her. Rebecca." Nathaniel repeated the name like a prayer. He'd known a Rebecca once, though her last name hadn't been Morrison. Time and distance could change many things, including names. "When did she pass?" "Week ago," Martha replied. "Fever took her quick. But before she went, she was raving something fierce about making sure Temperance stayed away from certain folks." Her eyes flickered meaningfully toward Judge Ashburn. "Said there were men who'd hurt the child if they got the chance." The crowd stirred uneasily. Everyone in Perdition Creek knew the judge's reputation, though few dared speak of it openly. Ashburn collected debts with interest and not always in coin. Young women who found themselves beholden to him often disappeared or turned up broken in ways that couldn't be easily mended. "That's enough speculation," Pike barked. "This is a legal proceeding. Either you got proof of paternity, Cross, or you can bid like everyone else." Nathaniel's weathered Winchester rifle hung across his back, its stock worn smooth by years of use. He hadn't fired it in anger since the war, but it had never forgotten how. Neither had he, if he was honest with himself. Some skills, once learned, stayed with a man until the grave. "I'll ask you once more, Sheriff," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The girl comes with me, or we have ourselves a different kind of conversation." Pike's hand twitched toward his gun, then stopped. He wasn't fast enough, and he knew it. More importantly, he knew that Nathaniel knew it. Judge Ashburn chose that moment to make his presence known, stepping through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Now, he said in his cultured Eastern accent, "let's not resort to threats, Mr. Cross, is it? I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We ain't been introduced at all," Nathaniel replied. "And I aim to keep it that way." The judge smiled, showing teeth too white and too perfect for a frontier town. "Perhaps we can work out an arrangement. The girl clearly needs a guardian, and if you're truly her father, well, blood tells, doesn't it? But there are proper channels for these things. Legal procedures to follow. Legal procedures." Nathaniel spat into the dust. "Like the kind that put a child on an auction block?" "The girl has debts," Ashburn explained smoothly. "Medical bills from her mother's final illness. Boarding costs. The generosity of our town has limits, I'm afraid." "How much?" "I beg your pardon?" "The debt." "How much is it?" Judge Ashburn's smile widened. $200. A fortune by frontier standards. Enough to buy a small ranch or a year's supplies. It was extortion, plain and simple, but Nathaniel had expected nothing less. "I'll work it off." Temperance spoke for the first time, her young voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. "Whatever Mama owed, I'll work it off. I ain't afraid of honest labor." "Child labor is hardly appropriate," Ashburn replied, though his eyes lingered on the girl in a way that made Nathaniel's skin crawl. "No, I think an auction is the most fair solution for everyone involved." Nathaniel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. The gold coins inside represented 15 years of trapping and hunting, of living off the land and wanting for nothing except human companionship. He'd been saving for retirement, maybe a small cabin closer to civilization, where he could spend his final years in something approaching comfort. All of that changed when he looked into Temperance's eyes and saw something worth more than gold. He counted out the coins slowly, letting each one ring against the auction block's wooden surface. The crowd watched in stunned silence as more wealth than most of them had ever seen in one place accumulated in a glittering pile. 200, Nathaniel said when he finished. "Now she comes with me." Judge Ashburn's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. This wasn't about money, it never had been. This was about power and control, and the kind of appetites that decent folks didn't discuss in polite company. "Of course," the judge said finally, "though I do hope you understand that guardianship carries certain responsibilities. Regular check-ins with the court, ensuring the child receives proper schooling and moral instruction. She'll get what she needs, Nathaniel replied. He turned to Temperance, who was staring at the gold with wide eyes. Come on, girl. Time to go. She hesitated for just a moment, then stepped down from the auction block with the careful dignity of someone who had learned not to trust sudden kindnesses. When she reached for the torn piece of her mother's dress, Nathaniel didn't try to stop her. Some things were worth holding on to, even if they brought pain. As they walked toward the edge of town, Nathaniel could feel the weight of 100 stares on his back. He'd made enemies today, powerful ones. Men like Ashburn didn't forgive public humiliation, and Sheriff Pike would be looking for any excuse to even the score. But when he glanced down at the girl walking beside him, his daughter now, by law, if not by blood, Nathaniel found he didn't much care about the enemies gathering in his wake. Some fights were worth having. Some lines were worth defending, and sometimes a man had to decide whether he wanted to die alone on a mountain or live for something bigger than himself. The Winchester on his back hadn't been fired in years, but it would remember how, when the time came, it always did. 3 days after the auction, Sheriff Pike came calling with papers that smelled of fresh ink and bad intentions. Nathaniel had been expecting it. Men like Judge Ashburn didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially not in front of half the town. The only surprise was that it had taken this long. He was teaching Temperance how to properly clean a fish when Pike's boots echoed across the cabin's front porch. The girl's hands were steady, despite the knife being nearly as long as her forearm. She had the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught, only encouraged. That's good, Nathaniel murmured, not looking up from his own work. Clean cuts, don't waste the meat. Your mama teach you that? Temperance nodded, then glanced toward the door as Pike's heavy knock interrupted the morning quiet. Should I hide? The question broke Nathaniel's heart a little. No child should have to ask such a thing. But then again, Temperance Morrison had learned hard lessons about the nature of men in authority. No, he said firmly. You belong here. Don't let anybody tell you different. Pike didn't wait for an invitation to enter. He pushed through the door like he owned the place, his tarnished badge catching the light from the fireplace. Behind him came 2 men Nathaniel didn't recognize, hired guns by the look of them, all swagger and quick-draw holsters. Morning, Cross, Pike said, his voice carrying false cheerfulness. Beautiful day, ain't it? Was, Nathaniel replied. He set down his knife, but kept his hands where they could move freely. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Pike produced a sheaf of official-looking documents. Court order. Seems there's been some questions raised about your claim to the girl. Judge wants to see proof of paternity, birth certificate, marriage license, something with legal weight. Nathaniel had been dreading this moment since he'd first opened his mouth at the auction. The truth was a luxury he couldn't afford, but lies had a way of catching up to a man when he least expected it. What kind of proof? He asked, though he already knew the answer. The kind you don't have, Pike said with satisfaction. Which means the girl comes back with us until this gets sorted proper. Temperance's knife clattered to the table. Her face had gone pale, but her jaw was set with the kind of stubborn determination Nathaniel was beginning to recognize as her defining characteristic. I ain't going back, she said quietly. I'll die first. Now that's just foolish talk, Pike began. But Nathaniel cut him off with a raised hand. She stays, he said simply. Can't do that. Gross, this here's a legal document signed by Judge Ashburn himself. Pike gestured to his hired guns. Boys are here to make sure there ain't no unpleasantness. The 2 men spread out slightly, hands hovering near their weapons. They were professionals, Nathaniel could tell, the kind who killed for money and slept well afterward. But they were also young and overconfident, used to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers. They'd never faced a man who had learned to kill in the woods of Virginia, where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury only the living could afford. There's something you should know, Temperance said suddenly. All eyes turned to her, and Nathaniel saw something shift in her expression, a decision being made. About why Mama really died, Pike frowned. Girl had fever. Doc Henderson said so himself. Doc Henderson said what he was paid to say. Temperance's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Mama didn't die of no fever. She was murdered. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Nathaniel felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, though the full picture remained frustratingly unclear. That's a serious accusation. Girl, Pike said, but there was wariness in his voice now. You got proof of such a thing? I was there. Temperance lifted her chin defiantly. I saw who done it. Mama made me hide in the root cellar when the men came, but I could hear everything. I could see through the floorboards. Nathaniel's blood went cold. No wonder the judge wanted the girl back so badly. A witness to murder, especially one involving Cornelius Ashburn, was worth more than all the gold in California. What men? He asked gently. Judge Ashburn and two others. They wanted something Mama had. Some papers, letters maybe. When she wouldn't give them up, the judge got angry. Temperance's voice cracked slightly. He hit her, hard. She fell and struck her head on the fireplace stones. Pike's face had gone ashen. Whatever game he'd been playing, it had just gotten considerably more dangerous. You sure about what you saw? He asked. Sure as sin. Temperance reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Mama gave me this before she died. Said to keep it safe no matter what. Nathaniel took the paper with hands that didn't quite shake. It was a letter, written in a feminine script that looked vaguely familiar. As he read, his world tilted on its axis. The letter was addressed to Rebecca Morrison, but it was signed by someone else entirely, Rebecca Whitfield. His Rebecca. The woman he'd loved before the war. Before everything went wrong, the letter spoke of a child. A daughter. Born 9 months after Nathaniel had left for Virginia, never to return. Sweet Jesus, he whispered. The hired guns were getting restless, hands creeping closer to their weapons. Pike looked like a man who had stepped in quicksand and only just realized his predicament. What's it say? Pike asked. Nathaniel folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. The truth was more complicated than he'd imagined, but also simpler in some ways. This girl, his daughter, had witnessed a murder. The judge wanted her silenced. Everything else was just window dressing. It says she's mine, he replied. Born Rebecca Whitfield. Changed her name to Morrison when she came west. This is her death confession, naming Judge Ashburn as her killer. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. The letter was proof enough of paternity, and Temperance's testimony would hang Ashburn if it ever reached the right ears. Pike was sweating now, despite the morning chill. I'm going to need to see that letter. No, Nathaniel said. You're not. This is a legal matter, Cross. You can't just... Sheriff. Nathaniel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You've got two choices. You can walk out of here and tell the judge that the girl's under my protection, legal and proper. Or you can try to take her, and we'll see how that works out for you. The hired guns tensed, reading the change in atmosphere. One of them, a thin man with nervous eyes, actually took a half step toward the door. There's 3 of us, Pike pointed out, though his voice lacked conviction. There's 3 of you now, Nathaniel agreed. Question is whether there'll be 3 of you walking out. His hand moved to rest casually on the Winchester's stock. The motion was slight, almost negligent, but it sent a clear message to anyone with sense. Pike looked at his hired guns, then at Nathaniel, then at Temperance, who was watching the proceedings with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for matters of life and death, which Nathaniel supposed this was. This ain't over, Pike said finally. No, Nathaniel agreed. It ain't. The sheriff and his men filed out without another word, but Nathaniel knew they'd be back. Next time with more men, better prepared, and considerably less inclined toward negotiation. When the sound of their horses faded into the distance, Temperance sagged against the table. Is it true? She asked quietly. What you said about the letter? Nathaniel pulled out the folded paper and handed it to her. Read it yourself. She did, her lips moving silently as she worked through the careful script. When she finished, her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. Mama kept your letters, she said. All of them. She used to read them to me when I was little, before I could read for myself. Said my daddy was a good man who got lost in the war. Maybe I did, Nathaniel said softly. Maybe I did at that. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains. By evening they'd have rain, and by morning they'd likely have visitors of the unfriendly sort. But for now, in the quiet of his cabin, Nathaniel Cross sat with his daughter and began to understand what he'd been missing all these years alone in the wilderness. It wasn't peace he'd been seeking. It was purpose, and sometimes purpose came with a price higher than a man could imagine. They left the cabin before dawn, traveling light and fast through terrain that would challenge most men half Nathaniel's age. Temperance kept pace without complaint, her young legs finding purchase on slopes that would have sent city folk tumbling into the ravines below. "Where are we going?" she asked during their first rest, accepting the jerky and hardtack Nathaniel offered without wrinkling her nose at the plain fare. "Higher," he replied. "Got another place deeper in the mountains. Harder to find, harder to reach." What he didn't tell her was that he'd spent the last 15 years preparing for something like this, not consciously perhaps, but with the instinctive thoroughness of a man who had learned that safety was always temporary and enemies could emerge from any shadow. The second cabin was built into the mountainside itself, its walls formed partly by carefully fitted logs and partly by the living rock of the peak. A man could approach it from only one direction, and only if he knew the way through a maze of false trails and dead-end canyons. "It's like a fortress," Temperance observed as they climbed the final switchback. "That's the idea." Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney designed to disperse smoke through natural rock formations to avoid detection. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that spoke of a more educated man than Nathaniel's rough exterior suggested. Temperance ran her fingers along the spines. Shakespeare, Dickens, Marcus Aurelius, Sun Tzu's Art of War. You read all these? "Time passes slow up here," Nathaniel said, suddenly self-conscious. "Books help." She pulled down a volume of poetry and opened it to a page marked with a dried wildflower. "Mama used to read to me. Before things got bad." The admission hung between them, a bridge across the awkwardness of two strangers learning to be family. Nathaniel found himself remembering Rebecca's voice, the way she used to read aloud while he whittled or cleaned his equipment. It seemed like another lifetime now. "Tell me about her," he said. "About your mama." Temperance settled into the cabin's single chair, a sturdy piece Nathaniel had built himself from pine and leather. In the firelight she looked even younger than her years, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no child should have. She was beautiful, Temperance began. Not just pretty, but beautiful in the way that made people stop and stare. She had this laugh that could fill up a whole room, make everyone else want to laugh too. Nathaniel worked while she talked, his hands busy with a piece of wood he'd been shaping for weeks without any clear purpose. Now, as he listened to his daughter speak, the wood began to take form under his knife, the graceful curve of a neck, the flowing lines of a mane. "She taught school for a while, before I was born. Said education was the only thing nobody could take away from you once you had it." Temperance paused, watching Nathaniel's hands move with surprising delicacy for their size and roughness. "What are you making?" "Horse," he said simply. "For you." The girl's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I always wanted a horse. Mama said maybe someday, when we had our own place." "Your mama was a dreamer," Nathaniel observed, though there was no criticism in his voice. "Always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. You remember her. It wasn't a question, and Nathaniel didn't treat it as one. I remember a lot of things I'd rather forget, and I forget too many things I'd rather remember." He paused in his carving, studying the girl's face in the flickering light. There was something of Rebecca in her features, certainly, but also something else, a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded him of his own father. "Tell me about the night she died," he said gently. "Everything you can remember." Temperance's smile faded, replaced by the haunted expression of someone reliving a nightmare. "They came after supper. 3 men on horseback, Judge Ashburn and 2 others I didn't recognize, not from town anyway. What did they want? Papers? Letters? Something Mama had that they thought was theirs. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. Mama told me to hide in the root cellar the minute she heard the horses. Said no matter what happened, I wasn't to come out until they were gone. Nathaniel's knife moved steadily, shaping the wooden horse's legs with careful precision. But you watched. There are gaps between the floorboards. I could see everything. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The judge was polite at first. Called her Rebecca, asked about her health, complimented the cabin. But his eyes were wrong, cold. What kind of papers was he looking for? Love letters, I think, old ones. Mama had a box she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Sometimes she'd take them out and read them when she thought I was sleeping. Nathaniel's hand stilled on the carving. Those letters, he'd written them during the war, when he still believed in things like honor and justice and the possibility of a future worth fighting for. He'd poured his heart onto those pages, shared dreams and fears he'd never spoken aloud. If Ashburn had been looking for them, it meant someone knew about his connection to Rebecca. Someone who understood that a man's past could be used as a weapon against him. Did she give them the letters? No. Temperance's voice carried a note of fierce pride. She told them she didn't know what they were talking about. Said she was just a widow woman trying to raise her daughter in peace. That's when things went bad. Judge Ashburn got angry. Started yelling about how she was protecting a deserter and a coward. Said you were never coming back, that you'd abandoned her just like you'd abandoned your duty. Tears tracked down Temperance's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Mama got angry then. Said you were twice the man any of them would ever be, and that she'd rather die than betray your memory. The wooden horse slipped from Nathaniel's suddenly nerveless fingers. She said that. She loved you, Temperance said simply. Even after all these years, even thinking you were dead, she loved you. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of lost years and missed chances. Outside, wind howled through the mountain peaks, but inside the cabin all was still. I should have come back, Nathaniel said finally. Why didn't you? The question he'd been dreading, asked with the directness only a child could manage. How could he explain the nightmares that had driven him into the wilderness? The guilt over things he'd done in the name of duty. The fear that the war had changed him into something Rebecca wouldn't recognize. I was broken, he said at last. The war broke something in me, and I didn't think I was fit for decent company anymore. But you came back now. Yeah, I did. Why? Nathaniel picked up the wooden horse and resumed his careful shaping. In the firelight, it was beginning to look almost alive. Ears pricked forward, head turned slightly as if listening for its rider's call. Because sometimes a man gets a second chance, he said. And sometimes he's smart enough to take it. Temperance smiled again, and for a moment the cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season early even for the high country. By morning, their tracks from the lower cabin would be covered, making them harder to follow. It was a small blessing. But Nathaniel had learned to be grateful for small blessings. They were going to need all the help they could get. On their third morning in the high cabin, Temperance showed him the locket. She'd been quiet during breakfast, picking at her food with the distracted air of someone wrestling with a difficult decision. Finally, as Nathaniel cleaned the dishes in a basin of melted snow, she reached into the bodice of her dress and withdrew a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. "Mama gave me this before she died," she said, holding it out with trembling hands. Said it was the most precious thing she owned. The locket was tarnished with age, but beautifully crafted, its surface engraved with tiny roses that spoke of a jeweler's careful attention. Nathaniel accepted it with the reverence reserved for religious artifacts, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he worked the tiny clasp. Inside was a photograph. The face that looked back at him from the faded sepia print was younger than he remembered, unlined by the years of hardship that mountain living had etched into his own features. But it was unmistakably his own face, captured by some traveling photographer during his brief leave before the Battle of Antietam. "She kept your picture all these years?" Temperance said softly. "Even when everyone told her you were dead, even when they said she should forget about you and find herself a new husband." Nathaniel stared at the photograph, memories flooding back like water through a broken dam. He remembered the day it was taken. Rebecca had insisted over his protests that such things were frivolous nonsense. She'd wanted something to remember him by, she'd said. Something to hold on to when the nights got too long and the waiting too hard. "There's something else," Temperance continued. She opened a small compartment on the locket's opposite side, revealing a folded piece of paper no bigger than a postage stamp. "Mama made me promise to keep this safe. Said if anything happened to her, I should give it to you." Nathaniel unfolded the paper with infinite care, afraid it might crumble at his touch. The writing was Rebecca's, he could tell, though the ink had faded to a pale brown and the paper was soft with handling. The message was brief. "Nathaniel, she is yours. Born March 15th, 1871. I named her Temperance because I hoped she would be the virtue that balanced your wildness. She has your eyes and your stubborn heart. Come home." Oh, the date hit him like a physical blow. March 15th, 1871. He'd been in a Union hospital at the time, recovering from a Confederate ball that had taken a chunk out of his shoulder and left him delirious with fever for the better part of a month. He'd received no letters during that time, and by the time he was well enough to read correspondence, Rebecca's messages had stopped coming entirely. He'd assumed she'd grown tired of waiting. It had never occurred to him that she might be too busy caring for his child to write. "She tried to find you," Temperance said, watching his face with careful attention. "After the war ended, she wrote letters to the War Department, to veterans' organizations, to anyone who might know what happened to you. They all said the same thing, that you deserted sometime after Gettysburg and disappeared into the wilderness." "I didn't desert," Nathaniel said quietly. "I mustered out legal and proper after my enlistment ended. But I didn't come home. Why?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. How could he explain the nightmares that had driven him into the mountains? The faces that haunted his sleep, enemy soldiers he'd killed, friends he'd watched die, civilians caught in the crossfire of a war that had long since lost any pretense of nobility. "I was afraid," he said finally. "Afraid of what the war had made me. Afraid I'd bring that darkness home to her?" Temperance nodded, as if she understood, though Nathaniel couldn't imagine how she could. She was too young to comprehend the weight that violence could place on a man's soul, too innocent to understand how killing could become as natural as breathing. "She never stopped loving you," she said. "Even when she married Mr. Morrison, even when she took his name, she kept your picture close to her heart." "She married?" "For a little while. He was a good man, kind to both of us, but he died of consumption when I was 7. Mama never took another husband after that." Nathaniel closed the locket carefully and handed it back to his daughter. The weight of lost years pressed down on him like a physical burden, all those opportunities for happiness squandered by his own cowardice. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not being there, for not knowing, for all of it." "You're here now," Temperance replied simply. Before he could respond, the sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed through the morning stillness. Nathaniel's hand moved instinctively to his Winchester, and he motioned for Temperance to get behind the cabin's heavy table. Through the single window, he could see movement in the tree line. 3 figures picking their way carefully up the mountain trail. They moved with the deliberate caution of men who expected trouble, their rifles held ready for immediate use. "Bounty hunters," Nathaniel murmured. "Ashburn must have put a price on our heads." The men below had found the cabin's location faster than he'd expected. Someone had talked, or someone had followed their trail despite the snow. Either way, their sanctuary had been compromised. "Can we get out?" Temperance whispered. Nathaniel studied the approaching figures with a soldier's eye for tactical assessment. They were spread out in a classic hunting formation, covering the most likely escape routes. Professional work, not the clumsy bullying he'd expected from Pike and his men. "Back door leads to a steep drop," he said. 50 feet of rock and ice, then another 100 feet to the tree line. Doable but dangerous. More dangerous than staying here. The first bullet shattered the window before Nathaniel could answer her question. Glass showered across the cabin floor as he rolled behind the stone fireplace, pulling Temperance with him. The Winchester came up smooth and natural, like he'd never stopped being a soldier. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once moved entire companies of men. "No matter what happens, you keep your head low." 2 more shots punched through the cabin's log walls, sending splinters flying. The bounty hunters were good. They'd positioned themselves to cover both the front door and the single window, turning the cabin into a trap. But Nathaniel had been building traps. Longer than these men had been alive, he'd constructed the cabin's defenses with this exact scenario in mind: thick walls that would stop most rifle rounds, a stone fireplace that provided solid cover, and most importantly, a back exit that looked like suicide, but was actually salvation for anyone brave enough to use it. "When I give the word," he told Temperance, "you run for that back door. Don't think, don't hesitate, just run. What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Someone had to hold the bounty hunter's attention long enough for her to reach the cliff face and start her descent. Someone had to buy time with gunfire and blood. Nathaniel had been buying time for other people's escapes since he was 19 years old. He knew the cost, and he was prepared to pay it. He rose smoothly from behind the fireplace, the Winchester's stock finding his shoulder with muscle memory older than conscious thought. The first bounty hunter was moving between trees, trying to get a better angle on the cabin. He was skilled, but he'd never learned to fight men who'd survived Antietam and Gettysburg. Nathaniel's first shot took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. The man's rifle went flying, his cry of pain echoing off the mountain peaks. The second hunter immediately returned fire, his bullets chewing chunks from the log wall inches from Nathaniel's head. But he'd revealed his position with muzzle flash, and Nathaniel was already adjusting his aim. The Winchester spoke again, and the second man's shooting stopped abruptly. "Go!" Nathaniel commanded without taking his eyes off the tree line. "Now!" Temperance ran, her feet silent on the cabin's wooden floor. She'd learned stealth from necessity, growing up in a world where being noticed could be dangerous. The third bounty hunter was smarter than his companions. Instead of revealing himself with premature shooting, he waited, patient as a mountain cat stalking its prey. Nathaniel respected that kind of discipline, even as he prepared to kill the man who possessed it. Minutes passed in tense silence. Outside, wind stirred the snow-laden branches, creating shadows that could hide a dozen men. Nathaniel's eyes swept the tree line methodically, looking for any hint of movement, any sign of his remaining opponent. Then he heard it, the soft scrape of boot leather on stone. Coming from the cabin's rear, the third hunter had circled around, using the noise of the gunfight to mask his movement. He was climbing toward the back door, intending to trap them between his position and the cliff face. What he didn't know was that Temperance was already halfway down the mountain, following handholds and footholds that Nathaniel had carved into the rock face years earlier. The girl had her mother's courage and her father's head for heights. Nathaniel moved to the back door, his Winchester ready. Through the narrow opening, he could see the bounty hunter's progress, a big man with careful hands and patient eyes, climbing with the steady determination of someone accustomed to hard work. When the man's head appeared over the doorframe, Nathaniel was waiting. "Afternoon," he said conversationally. The bounty hunter's eyes widened, but his hand was already moving toward the pistol at his hip. He was fast, faster than most men Nathaniel had faced, but most men weren't fast enough. The Winchester's barrel was pressed against the man's forehead before his gun cleared leather. "Easy," Nathaniel said. "Let's keep this civilized." The bounty hunter's hand slowly moved away from his weapon. He was older than his companions, maybe 45, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "Professional, but not stupid. You Nathan Cross?" he asked. "Some call me that. There's paper on you and the girl. $500, dead or alive. That's a lot of money." "It is." The bounty hunter studied Nathaniel's face with the interest of a man trying to memorize details. "You really her father?" "Does it matter?" "My word is she witnessed something she shouldn't have. Judge wants her quiet, permanent-like." Nathaniel's finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger. "And you're here to accommodate him?" "I'm here to earn $500. How I do it depends on you, meaning you can come back with me voluntary, stand trial legal and proper. Or I can drag your bodies down this mountain and collect the bounty either way." The bounty hunter's eyes were steady, professional. "Your choice." Nathaniel considered his options. He could kill this man. It would be easy enough and probably necessary in the long run. But murder left its own kind of stain on a man's soul, and he'd carried enough stains for one lifetime. "There's a third option," he said. "I'm listening. You tell Judge Ashburn that Nathan Cross is done running. Tell him if he wants the girl, he can come for her himself. But warn him that I've got nothing left to lose, and men like me are dangerous when we're cornered." The bounty hunter smiled without humor. "That a threat?" "That's a promise." They stared at each other for a long moment, two predators taking each other's measure. Finally, the bounty hunter nodded slowly. "I'll deliver your message," he said. "But Cross, next time we meet it won't be for conversation." "I understand." Nathaniel stepped back, letting the man retreat down the cliff face. He watched until the bounty hunter disappeared into the trees, then turned his attention to finding Temperance. He found her at the bottom of the mountain, crouched behind a fallen log, with tears streaming down her cheeks, but her jaw set with familiar determination. "I heard the shooting stop," she said. "I'm here," he said simply. "We're both here." But as they made their way deeper into the wilderness, Nathaniel knew their time was running out. Ashburn wouldn't be satisfied with bounty hunters much longer. Soon he'd come himself, and when he did, all the running in the world wouldn't be enough to save them. The compass in Nathaniel's vest pocket had belonged to his father, and his father before him. 3 generations of crossmen had used it to find their way through wilderness, both literal and metaphorical. Now, as he studied its needle pointing steadily north toward Canada, Nathaniel wondered if this would be where the family line ended. They'd been running for 6 days since the attack on the high cabin, moving through terrain that would challenge experienced trackers and kill casual pursuers. Temperance had proven herself tougher than Rawhide, never complaining despite the punishing pace and the bitter cold that turned their breath to ice crystals. "We could keep going," she said during their midday rest, reading the conflict in his weathered features. "Cross the border, start over somewhere they can't touch us." Nathaniel looked at his daughter, and she was his daughter now, in every way that mattered, and saw too much of himself in her green eyes. The same stubborn refusal to yield ground, the same willingness to fight impossible odds rather than admit defeat. "Running's got an ending point," he said, working his hands over a small fire built in the shelter of an overhanging rock. "Question is whether you choose that point, or it gets chosen for you. What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time we stopped letting other folks dictate our direction." They were camped in a box canyon that Nathaniel had discovered years earlier during his self-imposed exile. The entrance was narrow enough for one man to defend against many, and the walls were high enough to discourage casual climbing. More importantly, it connected to a network of caves that honeycombed the entire mountain range, passages that could hide a small army or provide escape routes that would take days to map. "Tell me again about that night," he said. "Everything you remember about what Judge Ashburn was looking for." Temperance poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the grey afternoon sky. "Like I said, papers, letters. He kept talking about evidence that needed to disappear." "Evidence of what?" "I don't know." But he was scared. Not angry scared like most men get when they're frustrated. Really scared like he was looking at his own grave. Nathaniel had known men like Cornelius Ashburn during the war, men who used their positions to profit while better men died. They were dangerous, not because they were brave or skilled, but because they had everything to lose and no moral boundaries to constrain their actions. "Your mama ever mention other letters? Messages from anyone else?" "Sometimes." She got correspondence from back east, relatives maybe, or old friends. But she was always careful about who saw them. Temperance looked up from the fire. You think there's more to this than just what I witnessed? I think your mama was a smart woman who understood that knowledge could be dangerous. If she kept those letters all these years, there was a reason. What Nathaniel didn't say was that he was beginning to suspect Rebecca's murder hadn't been about silencing a witness. It had been about retrieving something specific, something valuable enough to kill for. There's something else, Temperance said quietly. Something I didn't tell you before. Go on. When Judge Ashburn was searching through Mama's things, he found a key. Small brass thing, looked like it might open a safe deposit box, or maybe a strong box. He got real excited about it, asked Mama where she'd gotten it. What did she tell him? That it wasn't hers. Said someone had given it to her for safekeeping, but she wouldn't say who. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. A key suggested something more substantial than letters. Documents, maybe, or financial records. The kind of evidence that could destroy a man's reputation and send him to prison. You know where this key is now? Temperance reached into her dress and withdrew a small brass key, its surface worn smooth by handling. Mama pressed it into my hand right before she died. Said to keep it with the locket, no matter what. The key was unremarkable, except for a series of numbers etched into its head. A combination, perhaps, or a reference number of some kind. Nathaniel turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight of secrets and the burden of choices yet to be made. We need to find out what this opens, he said. How? We can't exactly walk into town and start asking questions. No, but we've got friends who can. Temperance looked puzzled. Friends? Nathaniel smiled, the first genuine expression of amusement she'd seen from him since they'd started running. You didn't think I'd lived alone up here for 15 years without making a few allies, did you? 2 hours later, they were descending into a hidden valley that most maps didn't acknowledge existed. The settlement that had grown up around a played-out silver mine consisted of perhaps 30 buildings, none of them impressive, but all of them solid and well-maintained. Welcome to Haven, Nathaniel said. Population 47 on a good day. 0 on the day the law comes calling. The residents of Haven were the kind of people who had reasons to avoid official attention. Deserters from both sides of the war, men who'd had disagreements with cattle barons, women who'd fled abusive husbands, and children who'd aged out of orphanages with nowhere else to go. What they shared was a code: mind your own business, pull your own weight, and stand together when the outside world threatened any member of the community. Nathan Cross, called a familiar voice as they approached the settlement's main street. Heard you'd taken up family responsibilities. The speaker was Sarah McKendrick, a woman in her 50s who'd fled Kansas after killing her husband in what any reasonable person would call self-defense. The law had disagreed, putting a price on her head that had driven her into the mountains 6 years earlier. Sarah, Nathaniel nodded respectfully. This is Temperance. My daughter. Figured as much. She's got your eyes and your mama's stubborn chin. Sarah studied the girl with the measuring gaze of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. Heard there's trouble following you both. Some. The kind that might spill over onto us. The kind I'm hoping to end before it gets that far. Sarah nodded slowly. In Haven, straight talk was valued above politeness, and everyone understood that individual troubles could become community problems without proper management. What do you need? Information. Someone in Perdition Creek has been collecting evidence on Judge Ashburn. Financial records, correspondence, maybe legal documents. Rebecca Morrison was keeping a key for them before she died, and you want to know what that key opens, and where. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Information gathering meant sending someone into town, which meant risk for whoever went. But it also meant the possibility of removing a threat that had been growing stronger every year. Judge Ashburn's corruption had been spreading like a cancer, reaching into mining claims and land disputes throughout the territory. More than one Haven resident had lost property or family to his machinations. I'll put the word out, Sarah said finally. Got contacts in town who owe favors. Give me 2 days. We might not have 2 days. Then we'd better hope those bounty hunters are slower than they look." As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses echoed off the valley walls. Multiple riders, moving fast and purposefully toward Haven's hidden entrance. Nathaniel's hand moved to his Winchester. Beside him, Temperance tensed like a deer sensing wolves. "How many people know about this place?" she whispered. "Not enough," Sarah replied grimly. "And apparently one too many." The riders who descended into Haven weren't bounty hunters. They were survivors, 3 men and 2 women, all bearing the weathered look of people who'd learned to expect the worst from life and were rarely disappointed. The leader was a man Nathaniel recognized, Marcus Stone, a former Union sergeant who'd disappeared after the war amid accusations of desertion. "Cross!" Stone called out as he dismounted. "We heard you were back in circulation." "Marcus." Nathaniel kept his rifle ready, but pointed it at the ground. "Been a while." "Too long." Stone's eyes moved to Temperance, then back to Nathaniel. "This your girl?" "She is." "Then you've got bigger problems than you know. Ashburn's put $1,000 bounty on both your heads. Half the territory's looking for you." Sarah McKendrick stepped forward, her own weapon prominently displayed. In Haven, courtesy extended only as far as mutual survival required. "You bring trouble to my door, Marcus Stone." "Brought warning," Stone replied. "And maybe a solution, if Cross has the stomach for it." The group that Stone led was a mixture of war veterans and frontier outcasts, people who'd been pushed beyond the boundaries of civilized society and had learned to thrive in the spaces between law and chaos. Nathaniel recognized the type because he'd been one himself for 15 years. "Talk," he said. "Judge Ashburn's been busy since you embarrassed him in town. Put together a private army, 20 men, maybe 30. Professional killers, not the usual frontier trash. He's planning to sweep these mountains clean, starting with Haven and working outward." The implications hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. By claiming Temperance, by making himself a target, he'd endangered everyone who'd ever shown him kindness or shelter. "When?" Sarah asked. 3 days, maybe 4. Depends on how long it takes him to coordinate with the territorial marshal. He's claiming you're harboring fugitives and murderers, which ain't exactly false. But it gives him legal cover for what he's planning. Temperance moved closer to Nathaniel's side, her young face pale but determined. "This is because of me," she said. "Because of what I saw. This is because of what your mama knew," Stone corrected gently. "What she was keeping safe for people who couldn't protect themselves, meaning." Stone reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, its surface worn smooth by handling. "Your mama wasn't just keeping a key, girl. She was keeping records. Financial documents, correspondence, legal papers, everything needed to prove that Cornelius Ashburn has been stealing land and money from half the territory." Nathaniel took the portfolio with hands that didn't quite steady. Inside were dozens of documents, some official, others handwritten. Bank records showing suspicious transfers, land deeds with forged signatures, letters discussing bribes and intimidation. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Rebecca Morrison wasn't the only person keeping evidence," Stone explained. "Ashburn's been corrupt for years, but he's also been careful. Too careful for any one person to gather enough proof to hang him. So a group of us started pooling information. Landowners he'd cheated, businessmen he'd ruined, families he'd destroyed. A conspiracy, a reckoning." Stone's voice carried the hard edge of a man who'd seen too much injustice and decided to do something about it. "Your woman volunteered to be the central repository because she was smart, careful, and had legitimate reasons to receive correspondence from multiple sources." Temperance was staring at the documents with wide eyes. "Mama never told me. She was protecting you. The less you knew, the safer you were." Stone's expression softened slightly. "She loved you enough to die rather than give up that key. But she gave me the key anyway, because she knew you'd find your way to your father, and she trusted him to finish what we started." Nathaniel felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome coat. For 15 years, He'd avoided taking sides, avoided getting involved in other people's fights. Now circumstances and blood had conspired to make him the center of a conflict he'd never wanted. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Lead us," Stone said simply. "You've got the military experience, and more importantly, you've got something the rest of us don't, which is nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a signal fire. Around them, the residents of Haven had begun to gather, men and women who'd found sanctuary in this hidden valley and weren't eager to give it up without a fight. "How many can you field?" Nathaniel asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical patterns that had once made him valuable to the Union Army. 43 from Haven," Sarah replied. "Maybe 20 more from the surrounding area if we put out the word. Against 30 professional killers. Against one corrupt judge and the system that protects him," Stone corrected. "The killers are just hired help. Cut off the head and the body dies." Nathaniel studied the portfolio again, noting names and dates and amounts that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade. Judge Ashburn hadn't just been taking bribes, he'd been orchestrating a campaign of theft and intimidation that had impoverished dozens of families and driven honest people from their homes. "There's something else," Stone continued. "Something your Rebecca figured out before she died. The key she was keeping doesn't open a safe deposit box in Perdition Creek." "Where then?" "Denver, First National Bank, under the name Elizabeth Cross." The name hit Nathaniel like a mule kick. Elizabeth had been his sister's name, the sister who died of scarlet fever when she was 10 years old. Rebecca would have known that, would have understood the significance. "She opened an account in your sister's name," Stone explained. "Deposited copies of everything we gave her, along with a detailed confession of what she knew about Ashburn's activities. Legal testimony that would stand up in any honest court. Meaning we don't just have evidence of his crimes. We have a dead woman's sworn statement that he murdered her to keep her quiet." Temperance looked up at her father with eyes that held more hope than a 12-year-old should have to carry. "Does this mean we can stop running?" "It means we can start fighting back," Nathaniel replied. He closed the portfolio and handed it back to Stone, his decision made with the kind of finality that had once moved armies across battlefields. 3 days to coordinate," he said. "Sarah, I need every able-bodied person in this valley ready to fight. Marcus, send word to your contacts. Anyone who's got a grievance with Ashburn, anyone who's lost something to his corruption. Tell them it's time to settle accounts." And then Nathaniel looked at his daughter, seeing Rebecca's courage burning in eyes that also held his own stubborn refusal to yield. "Then we go to war." The war medal hidden in his belongings wasn't the only thing he'd brought, back from the conflict that had shaped his generation. He'd also brought back the knowledge that sometimes, when all other options were exhausted, violence was the only language that evil men understood. Judge Cornelius Ashburn was about to receive a lesson in that particular dialect. The birth certificate was hidden in the lining of Rebecca's Bible. Temperance discovered it by accident, while helping Sarah McKendrick sort through the belongings they'd salvaged from her mother's cabin before Ashburn's men burned it to the ground. The leather binding had split along the spine, revealing a carefully folded document that had been sewn into the cover itself. "What's this?" she asked, holding up the yellowed paper. Sarah took it with careful hands, her weathered face growing solemn as she read. When she finished, she looked up at Nathaniel with something approaching awe. "You need to see this." The document was a birth certificate from the town of Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory, dated March 15th, 1871. The child's name was listed as Temperance Rebecca Cross. The mother was Rebecca Whitfield Cross. The father was Nathan William Cross. Nathaniel stared at the paper until the words blurred together. All this time, his claim to be Temperance's father had been a desperate lie, a gamble born of conscience and desperation. Now, holding legal proof in his hands, he realized the truth was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. "She married you," Temperance whispered. Mama married you before I was born. Apparently so. His voice came out rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. Sarah pointed to a notation at the bottom of the certificate. Marriage performed by proxy on October 12, 1870. Groom absent due to military service. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Rebecca had loved him enough to marry him, even when he was hundreds of miles away, fighting a war that seemed to have no end. She'd used a legal procedure that allowed soldiers to marry their sweethearts without being present, trusting in promises he'd made before he left for Virginia, promises he'd forgotten in the horror and chaos that followed. "There's more," Sarah said gently. She'd found a second document tucked behind the first, a letter addressed to Nathan Cross, dated 6 months after Temperance's birth. "My dearest husband." It began, "I pray this letter finds you alive and well. Our daughter grows stronger every day, and I see so much of you in her eyes. The army tells me you were wounded at Petersburg, but they have no current address for you. I'm writing to every hospital, every veterans organization, hoping one of these letters will reach you. Please come home to us. We need you more than ever." There were 12 more letters, each one growing more desperate as the months passed without reply. The final letter was dated almost 2 years after the war's end. "Nathan, I don't know if you're alive or dead, but I can't keep writing to a ghost. I'm taking our daughter and starting over somewhere new. If you ever receive these letters, if you ever want to find us, we'll be in Perdition Creek under the name Morrison. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to wait forever." Nathaniel's hands shook as he set the letters aside. All those years of self-imposed exile, all that time spent believing he was protecting Rebecca from the darkness he'd brought home from war, and she'd been waiting for him. She'd been his wife, legally and truly, and he'd abandoned her when she needed him most. "You didn't know," Temperance said softly, reading the guilt in his expression. I should have." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. How could he explain the nightmares that had driven him into the wilderness? The way gunfire made him reach for weapons that weren't there. The faces that haunted his sleep, friend and foe alike. "The army told her you'd been wounded," Sarah observed, studying the letters. "But they didn't know where you'd gone after you mustered out. Far as they were concerned, you'd just disappeared." "I did disappear. That was the point. But she never stopped looking." Temperance was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks as she held her parents' marriage certificate. "She used to tell me stories about you. Said you were the bravest man she'd ever known, but that the war had hurt you in ways that didn't show on the outside. She was right about that. She said someday you'd come home to us. Even after she married Mr. Morrison, even after she took his name, she said someday her real husband would find his way back." The weight of lost years pressed down on Nathaniel like a mountain of stone. His wife, because Rebecca had been his wife legally and spiritually, had died believing he might still come for her. And he had come, but 15 years too late to matter. "There's something else," Marcus Stone said from the doorway. He'd been standing there for several minutes, listening to revelations that changed everything about their situation. "Something you need to know about Judge Ashburn." "What now?" Stone stepped into the room, his face grave. He knew. About the marriage, about the birth certificate, about everything. That's why he killed her. Not just to keep her quiet about what she'd witnessed, but to eliminate the legal proof of your marriage. How could he know? Because he's been watching you for years. Ever since word started spreading about the mountain man who'd bought a girl at auction, claiming to be her father. He had people research your background, your military service, your connection to Rebecca Whitfield. The implications hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He knew I was telling the truth before I did. More than that, he knew that if you ever found out the truth, you'd have legal standing to challenge his authority. A decorated war veteran with legitimate grievances and legal proof of corruption. That's the kind of enemy he couldn't afford to have. So he tried to eliminate us both. And when that failed, he decided to eliminate everyone who might support you. Haven, the other settlements, anyone who might give you sanctuary. Stone's voice was grim. "This isn't about justice anymore, Cross. It's about survival." Temperance looked up from the marriage certificate, her young face set with determination that reminded Nathaniel painfully of her mother. "What do we do?" "We finish what your mother started," Nathaniel replied. "We make sure Judge Ashburn pays for what he's done." "All of it?" "All of it. The theft, the corruption, the murder." He took the birth certificate from her hands and studied it again, seeing not just legal proof, but a promise he'd never known he'd made. "Your mama kept faith with me for 15 years. Time I returned the favor." Outside, the sound of horses echoed off the valley walls, riders approaching at speed. But this time, Nathaniel didn't reach for his weapon. This time, he reached for his daughter's hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's go introduce ourselves to our army." The war medal hidden in his belongings had been awarded for valor at Gettysburg, where he'd held a strategic position against overwhelming odds until reinforcements could arrive. The citation spoke of courage under fire and devotion to duty that went beyond the call of normal service. What it didn't mention was that he'd been fighting not just for the Union cause, but for the idea of coming home to a woman who loved him and a future they could build together. That future had been stolen from him by war and trauma and his own cowardice, but he had a second chance now. A daughter who needed him, a wife's memory to honor, and enemies who thought they could profit from other people's pain. Judge Cornelius. Ashburn was about to learn why the Confederate Army had put such a high price on Nathan Cross's head. Some debts could only be paid in blood. The battle plan Nathaniel drew on the back of Rebecca's Bible was a thing of beauty, if you understood the mathematics of death and the geometry of desperation. "Ashburn's got 30 men, maybe more by now," he said, addressing the assembled defenders of Haven. "They'll come at us from 3 directions, thinking to pin us in this valley and finish us clean." The map showed the approaches to Haven, with the kind of tactical detail that spoke of long experience reading terrain like a book. Every ridgeline, every natural choke point, every position that could provide cover or commanding views was marked with careful precision. "What they don't know," he continued, "is that we're not planning to defend this place." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Haven was these people's home, their sanctuary. The idea of abandoning it went against every instinct they'd developed during their years of exile. "Then what are we planning to do?" Sarah McKendrick asked. "We're going to use their expectations against them. Let them think they've got us trapped, then hit them when and where they least expect it." Nathaniel pointed to a spot on the map, 2 miles south of the valley entrance. "Perdition Creek. While they're busy burning an empty settlement, we're going to be taking their base of operations. The whole town, the courthouse, the bank, the telegraph office. Everything that gives Ashburn his power." His finger traced a path through the mountain passes that would bring them to the town's outskirts, while their enemies were focused elsewhere. "By the time they realize what's happening, we'll have all the evidence we need and the means to get it to the territorial capital." Marcus Stone studied the plan with a soldier's eye for tactical detail. "Risky. If they catch us in the open, we're outnumbered 3-1. "If they catch us," Nathaniel agreed. "But they won't be looking for us in Perdition Creek. Far as they know, we're holed up here waiting for them to come finish the job." "What about the town's defenders?" "Sheriff Pike's got deputies, and there are bound to be men loyal to Ashburn. Pike's a coward who won't fight unless he's got overwhelming odds. As for Ashburn's supporters, most of them are more interested in profit than principle. When they see which way the wind's blowing, they'll find reasons to be elsewhere." Temperance had been listening with the focused attention of someone learning lessons that might mean the difference between life and death. "What about me?" she asked. "You're staying here with the non-combatants." "I'm not." Her voice carried the same stubborn certainty Nathaniel had heard from her mother years earlier. "This fight is as much mine as anyone's, maybe more. You're 12 years old. I'm the only witness to Judge Ashburn's crimes. I'm the one person who can testify to what really happened the night Mama died." She met his eyes with unflinching determination. "You need me." Nathaniel wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to keep his daughter safe while the adult world exploded around her. But he'd learned enough about Temperance. Morrison Cross to know that she'd find a way to be part of this fight, whether he approved or not. Better to have her where he could protect her than wondering where she'd gone and what kind of trouble she'd found. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay close to me, and you do exactly what I tell you." "No exceptions, no exceptions," she agreed. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and positioning. Weapons were cleaned and distributed, ammunition was counted and rationed, and the non-combatants were moved to caves high in the mountains where they could wait out the coming storm. Nathaniel found himself remembering the preparations before major battles during the war, the same mixture of anticipation and dread, the same careful attention to details that might mean the difference between victory and disaster. But this was different. This wasn't about preserving the Union or freeing the slaves or any of the grand causes that had motivated his generation. This was about justice for one murdered woman and protection for the people who'd offered sanctuary when sanctuary was desperately needed. It was, he realized, the first fight of his life that was entirely about doing what was right rather than following orders or serving abstract principles. "You ready for this?" Marcus Stone asked on the evening before the attack. They were standing at the valley's edge, looking out over miles of wilderness that would either provide cover for their approach or become their graveyard, depending on how the next 24 hours unfolded. As ready as a man can be for something like this. Regrets? Nathaniel thought about the question seriously. Regrets about Rebecca, certainly, about the years they'd lost and the chances they'd never had. Regrets about the war and the things it had required of him. But about this fight, this moment, this decision to stand up to corruption and murder. "No," he said. "No regrets." "Good, because there's something I haven't told you about Judge Ashburn." "What's that?" "He's not just corrupt. He's smart, and he's desperate. Men like that don't go down easy, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process." "Meaning?" "Meaning he knows we're coming. Maybe not when, maybe not exactly how, but he knows. And he's planning something that goes beyond just hunting us down in these mountains." Nathaniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves hostages and human shields and burning towns to cover his tracks." Stone's voice was grim. "Word from my contacts in Perdition Creek is that he's been moving people around, families with children mostly, gathering them in places where they can be used as leverage if things go wrong." The tactical implications were staggering. If Ashburn was willing to use innocent people as shields, it would complicate every aspect of their planned attack. First, it suggested a level of desperation that made him capable of almost anything. How many hostages? 20 families, maybe 30. All of them people who've spoken out against him or who have information he wants to keep quiet. Where is he keeping them? The church, the school, the hotel. Places where attacking them would require us to hurt innocent people. Nathaniel studied his battle plan again, seeing how Ashburn's countermeasures would force him to choose between tactical advantage and moral constraint. It was a clever strategy. Use the attacker's own decency against them, but it was also the kind of strategy that revealed the true nature of the man who employed it. Changes things. Stone observed, changes the approach maybe. Doesn't change the objective. You've got a plan for dealing with hostages. I've got a daughter who can walk into that town without anyone suspecting what she's really there for. I've got allies among the townspeople who've been waiting for someone to make a move against Ashburn. And I've got 15 years of anger that needs somewhere to go. Nathaniel folded up his battle plan and tucked it into his coat pocket. The drawing was just lines on paper now. The real plan existed in the connections he'd built, the trust he'd earned, and the desperate courage of people who'd had enough of being afraid. "Tomorrow morning, we split into 3 groups," he said. "Sarah takes half our people and creates a diversion at the North Pass, enough noise and movement to convince Ashburn's men that we're making our stand there. Marcus, you take another group and hit their supply lines, make them think we're trying to starve them out. And you? I take Temperance and 6 of our best people, and we go straight into the heart of town. While everyone's looking the wrong direction, we free the hostages and secure the evidence we need." "That's not a plan." Stone said. That's barely even a wish. It's what we've got, and if it goes wrong... Nathaniel looked back toward the valley where his daughter was probably trying to sleep, despite the weight of tomorrow's uncertainties. She lost her mother to Judge Ashburn's greed and violence. She'd spent weeks running and hiding, never knowing if the next sunrise would be her last. She deserved better than a life spent in fear. If it goes wrong, he said, at least we'll have died trying to do something right. The war medal in his belongings had been awarded for holding impossible ground against overwhelming odds. Tomorrow, he'd find out if the lessons learned in that long-ago battle still applied when the stakes were personal and the enemy wore a judge's robes instead of a soldier's uniform. Some fights were worth losing, but this one he intended to win. The Perdition Creek Courthouse stood like a monument to corrupted justice, its imposing facade hiding the rot that had spread through every aspect of the town's legal system. Nathaniel crouched behind the blacksmith's forge, studying the building through the pre-dawn gloom. 6 men with rifles were positioned around the courthouse, professional guards, not local deputies. Judge Ashburn was taking no chances with the evidence that could destroy him. "How do we get past them?" whispered Tom Garrett, one of the Haven volunteers who'd insisted on joining the mission despite having a wife and 3 children to think about. "We don't go past them," Nathaniel replied. "We go through the front door." Before anyone could protest, he stepped into the street with his hands raised in apparent surrender. The guards reacted immediately, rifles swinging toward this unexpected target. "Easy, boys," Nathaniel called out in a voice pitched to carry. "I'm here to see Judge Ashburn. Got something he wants." Nathan Cross? The lead guard was a professional killer named Jake Morrison, no relation to Rebecca, despite the shared surname. "You're supposed to be dead. Disappointed?" "Depends on what you're carrying." Nathaniel held up a leather satchel. "Evidence. The kind Judge Ashburn's been looking for. The kind that could put a lot of important people in very uncomfortable positions." Morrison studied him with calculating eyes. The bounty on Cross was substantial, but the judge had been very specific about wanting the man taken alive if possible. There were questions that needed answering before this situation could be permanently resolved. "Walk forward slow," Morrison commanded. "Hands where I can see them." Nathaniel complied, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood he was balanced on the edge of a very sharp knife. Behind him, hidden in the pre-dawn shadows, his companions waited for the signal they'd rehearsed. "Stop there." Morrison was 20 feet away, close enough to put a bullet through Nathaniel's heart, but far enough to have reaction time if this was some kind of trick. "Open the satchel." "Can't do that." "Why not?" "Because it's not for you. It's for Ashburn." Personal delivery. Morrison's patience was wearing thin. The plan had been simple. Cross would try to infiltrate the town, they'd capture or kill him, and the threat would be eliminated. This negotiation wasn't part of the script. "Judge ain't here," he said finally. "Where is he?" "Safe, where men like you can't touch him." "Men like me?" Nathaniel's voice carried a note of grim amusement. "You know what kind of man I am, Morrison? The kind that's about to die. The kind that doesn't make surrender speeches without backup." The first shot came from the church bell tower, where Marcus Stone had positioned himself with a rifle and a clear view of the courthouse square. Morrison spun around, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering to the ground. The other guards tried to react, but they'd been positioned to defend against a frontal assault, not a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Tom Garrett and his companions emerged from concealment with weapons ready, their movements precise and purposeful. "Drop them!" Nathaniel commanded, his own rifle now in his hands. "Nobody has to die here." Most of the guards were smart enough to recognize when the odds had shifted against them. Weapons hit the ground with metallic clangs that echoed off the courthouse walls. But Morrison wasn't finished. Despite his wounded shoulder, he rolled toward his fallen rifle. Desperation overcoming tactical sense, Nathaniel's shot took him center mass. The Winchester's report sharp and final in the morning air. "Should have stayed." "Down," he said quietly. The courthouse doors opened with Surprising ease, Ashburn's confidence in his guards had made him careless about basic security. Inside, the building was a maze of offices and corridors that spoke of bureaucratic importance and legal authority. What it didn't speak of was justice. Where would he keep the records? Tom asked, studying the directory mounted on the lobby wall. Somewhere secure but accessible, Nathaniel replied. He'd need to reference them regularly, but he'd also need to control who could see them. They found Judge Ashburn's private office on the second floor. Its heavy door secured with a lock that yielded to Tom's crowbar after only token resistance. Inside, the walls were lined with filing cabinets and safes that contained the paper trail of a decade's worth of corruption. "Jesus," Tom whispered, staring at ledgers that detailed bribes, land seizures, and financial manipulations that had impoverished dozens of families. "Evidence," Nathaniel corrected. "Finally, evidence that can't be dismissed or ignored." But even as he spoke, he could hear sounds from the street below, horses, shouting voices, the distinctive rattle of weapons being prepared for use. Judge Ashburn's men were returning from their failed hunt in the mountains, and they were bringing reinforcements. The real battle was about to begin. Judge Cornelius Ashburn arrived with 20 armed men and the kind of cold fury that came from seeing years of careful planning unravel in a single morning. "Cross!" His voice boomed across the courthouse square. "I know you're in there. Come out and let's finish this like civilized men." Nathaniel appeared at a second-floor window, his rifle visible but not immediately threatening. "Civilized men don't murder women and children, Judge. Civilized men don't steal from widows and orphans. You're in no position to lecture me about morality. You're a deserter and a killer, and that girl you claim is your daughter is a witness to treason. What treason would that be? The treason of men who put personal gain above the rule of law." The irony was so complete that several townspeople who'd gathered to watch the confrontation actually laughed. Judge Ashburn's face darkened with embarrassment and rage. "Surrender now, and I'll guarantee you a fair trial." Your idea of a fair trial and mine seemed to differ considerably. While they talked, Temperance was moving through the courthouse's basement levels, following passages that connected to the town's other public buildings. The plan was simple. While her father held Ashburn's attention, she would free the hostages who'd been imprisoned in the church and school. What she found there made her understand just how desperate and dangerous their enemy had become. Families were crammed into rooms with boarded windows and locked doors. Children cried while their parents tried to comfort them with words that carried no conviction. The smell of fear and confinement hung in the air like smoke. "Who's there?" called a familiar voice as Temperance worked at the church's cellar door with a crowbar Tom Garrett had given her. "It's Temperance Cross," she replied. "I'm here to get you out." The door opened to reveal Martha Holcomb and a dozen other townspeople, their faces bearing the strain of days spent wondering if they'd live to see their freedom again. "Child, what are you doing here?" Martha asked. "This place is crawling with Ashburn's men. My father's keeping them busy. We need to get everyone to safety before..." The sound of gunfire from the courthouse square cut her off. The talking was over. The shooting had begun. Back at the courthouse, Nathaniel had made his own decision about the futility of negotiation. When Judge Ashburn ordered his men to storm the building, Nathaniel's response was swift and decisive. The Winchester spoke from the second-floor window, its first shot dropping the man leading the charge up the courthouse steps. The second shot scattered the others, sending them diving for cover behind water troughs and hitching posts. "You want a war, Judge?" Nathaniel called down. "You've got one." What followed was the kind of close-quarters urban fighting that most soldiers only experienced in nightmares. Ashburn's men tried to storm the courthouse from multiple directions, only to discover that Nathaniel had turned the building into a fortress. Furniture barricaded doorways. Windows provided shooting positions with overlapping fields of fire. The building's solid construction meant that small arms fire couldn't penetrate the walls, giving the defenders a crucial advantage. But numbers mattered too, and Ashburn had plenty of those. "Tom," Nathaniel called to his companion. who was covering the building's rear entrance. "How are we fixed for ammunition?" "Getting low. Maybe 20 rounds left. Make them count. Outside." Judge Ashburn was learning the same lesson that had cost the Confederate Army so dearly during the war, that attacking prepared positions held by determined defenders was a costly proposition. "Burn them out," he ordered, his veneer of civilization finally stripped away. "I don't care about the building. I don't care about the evidence. I want Cross dead." But even as his men prepared torches, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the town. A large group of riders was coming fast from the direction of the mountains, and they weren't flying Ashburn's colors. Sarah McKendrick led 30 men and women from Haven and the surrounding settlements, all of them armed and ready for the fight they'd been postponing for years. Behind them came townspeople who'd finally found the courage to stand up to the corruption that had poisoned their community. "Ashburn!" Sarah's voice carried across the square with the authority of someone who'd seen enough injustice for one lifetime. "Your reign ends today." The judge looked around desperately, realizing that his carefully planned trap had become a trap for him. The hostages were free, the evidence was secured, and his hired guns were outnumbered by people who had nothing left to lose. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward his horse, but it was over. And everyone present knew it, except for one final card that Ashburn had yet to play. One last desperate gambit that would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether corruption would triumph through sheer ruthlessness. From the crowd of townspeople, a small figure stepped forward. Temperance Cross walked into the middle of the courthouse square, her young voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Judge Ashburn," she said, "I have something to tell everyone about the night you murdered my mother." 6 months later, Nathaniel Cross stood in the doorway of what had once been Judge Ashburn's courthouse, watching his daughter practice her letters at a desk that had once belonged to the territory's most corrupt official. The building had been transformed into Perdition Creek's new schoolhouse, its dark history swept away by children's laughter and the scratch of chalk on slate boards. Temperance had volunteered to help the younger students with their reading, a task that came naturally to a girl who'd grown up surrounded by books and a mother who believed education was the foundation of freedom. "She's doing well," observed Martha Holcomb, who'd accepted the position of head teacher after the town's previous educator fled with Judge Ashburn's other supporters. "She is," Nathaniel agreed. "Takes after her mother that way." The aftermath of that final confrontation had unfolded with surprising swiftness. Temperance's public testimony, delivered with the kind of clear-eyed courage that silenced even Ashburn's most loyal supporters, had broken the judge's hold over the town's imagination. When faced with a 12-year-old girl who spoke without fear about witnessing murder, even the most corrupt officials found it difficult to maintain their pretense of respectability. Judge Ashburn himself had made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, drawing a hidden derringer and pointing it at Temperance with shaking hands. His intention had been clear: silence the witness permanently and hope that fear would keep others from speaking out. He'd never gotten the chance to fire. Nathaniel's shot had been clean and final, ending Cornelius Ashburn's reign of corruption with the same brutal efficiency that had once made Nathan Cross a legend among Union sharpshooters. "No regrets?" Sarah McKendrick had asked later, as they'd watched the territorial marshal's men cart away the evidence that would reform the entire regional government. "None," Nathaniel had replied, and meant it. The investigation that followed had revealed the full scope of Ashburn's criminal enterprise. Dozens of land seizures were reversed, stolen money was returned to its rightful owners, and a network of corrupt officials found themselves facing federal charges. More importantly, the people of Perdition Creek began to remember what it felt like to live without fear. "Papa," Temperance called from her desk, using the title that still made Nathaniel's heart skip a beat. "Can you help Jimmy with his arithmetic? He's struggling with the multiplication tables." "Of course." The boy in question was perhaps 8 years old, the son of a blacksmith who'd been one of Ashburn's victims. His family had lost their shop to fraudulent debt proceedings, and only the judge's downfall had allowed them to reclaim their livelihood. "What's 7 times 8? Nathaniel asked, settling into a chair beside the boy. "I don't know, sir. Numbers get all mixed up in my head. That's all right. Let's try a different approach." Nathaniel pulled out his whittling knife and a small piece of wood. "Instead of thinking about numbers, think about making something useful." He began carving with quick, sure strokes, his hands creating the rough outline of a horse. 7 cuts here, 8 cuts there. Every cut has to be precise, or the whole thing doesn't work. The boy watched with fascination as the wooden figure took shape. 56 cuts. That's right. 7 times 8 equals 56. Now you try. It was a method Nathaniel had developed during his years of teaching temperance, turning abstract concepts into concrete actions that made sense to young minds. The approach had worked with his daughter, and it seemed to work with the other children as well. Outside the schoolhouse windows, Perdition Creek was transforming itself from a haven for corruption into something approaching a real community. New businesses were opening, families were moving in, and the kind of casual cruelty that had once characterized daily life was being replaced by the basic human decency that most people preferred when given the choice. "There's been a letter," Martha said quietly, approaching Nathaniel with an envelope bearing official seals. "From Denver. From Washington. The territorial governor wants to offer you a position, territorial marshal with jurisdiction over the entire region." Nathaniel studied the letter without opening it. 6 months ago, the prospect of returning to official service would have filled him with horror. The idea of carrying a badge, of being responsible for other people's safety, of making the kinds of decisions that could determine who lived and who died. It would have sent him running back to his mountain cabin within minutes. But 6 months ago, he'd been a different man. A man without family, without purpose, without the kind of roots that made staying in one place feel like blessing rather than burden. "What do you think?" he asked Temperance when she joined them. "I think you'd be good at it," she replied seriously. "You understand what justice really means. Not everyone does. It would mean staying here permanently. No more hiding in the mountains when things get complicated. I like it here. I like having friends my own age, and I like learning new things every day." She paused, studying his weathered face with eyes that saw more than most adults. "But mostly, I like having a father who isn't afraid of the world anymore." The words hit him like a revelation. Somewhere during their flight from corruption and their fight for justice, he'd stopped being afraid. Not of death, he'd never been afraid of that, but of life, of connection, of the possibility that he might actually deserve the love and loyalty that others were willing to offer. "Then I guess we stay," he said, opening the letter to read the territorial governor's formal offer. Outside, winter was giving way to spring, and the sound of children playing echoed off the buildings that had once housed only fear and greed. Nathaniel Cross accepted the position of territorial marshal 3 days later, and spent the rest of his life proving that sometimes a man's greatest victory was learning how to stop running from the very things that could make him whole. The wooden horses he carved for the school children became legendary throughout the territory, not because they were particularly artistic, but because they carried the kind of love and patience that transforms simple gifts into treasured memories. Some foundations, once properly laid, last for generations.